This is me from a week ago. Say hi, me from a week ago.
Hello.
Good job. It is indeed true. I have caught the terrarium making bug, and I have decided to make my first ever jar terrarium. The goal of this terrarium is to be fully enclosed with a small little bit of native plants and animals from my area. Of course, in order to make a jar terrarium, I needed a jar. So I went to Walmart and got this one for just under $5. It is fairly good sized. It comes with a sealing lid that does have a rubber gasket, and the hopes behind this is that the gasket itself would help keep all the moisture inside of the terrarium. That's the white bit you see there. And like I said, good sized terrarium. And my plan going into this was to fill up the dirt, have the jar laid down sideways, and then fill it up with dirt on the side. That's why I got it to where it had flat surfaces. So, if you live near Walmart, you should be able to find a jar just like this if you want to use the jar that I'm using here. The supplies that I would be taking with me were this gardening trowel and a shoebox lined with a garbage bag. And because it was Western PA, I lined myself up with bug spray, because I didn't want Lyme disease. After applying that and poorly filming it, I set off. My destination of choice was the local creek by the woods. And after scanning around for a little bit, I decided to start off with some dirt from the creek bank. So I grabbed my gardening trowel and began to scoop out the earth. And yes, the first scoop was with the trowel upside down. Don't mind that. My bad. After a few more scoops of the fertile creek bank dirt, I turned my attention to the edge of the woods, where I would find the plants that I would use at my terrarium. As I looked around for plants to dig out, I found a small piece of wood and decided that would be a nice addition to the terrarium. It would slowly replenish the soil over time and would give the isopods a place to hide. More on the isopods later. After having found some plants I deemed suitable, I attempted to dig them up. Only problem was, I was filming at the same time, and filming quite badly. So instead of digging up the plants, I managed to lacerate both them and the ground instead. This was hopeless, so I set the iPod aside and focused on gathering what I needed. After having dug up the plants and grabbed some more dirt from the creek, I was ready to set the terrarium up. But before I could put anything in the terrarium, I had to rinse the jar out, freeing it of any dust and other unwanted particles. And after a quick dry from the paper towel, it was ready. The first thing that I put in the terrarium was a thin layer of gravel. This would help any excess water drain out from the soil, and would also assist towards the condensation of the jar and keeping the moisture within the jar. After the gravel was in place, it was time for the dirt. I proceeded to place another garbage bag underneath the jar itself to catch any of the excess dirt that would fall out of my hands as I was scooping it into the jar. And with the protection in place, it was time to begin adding dirt. By the handful, I began shoving the dirt and patting it into place. Although difficult due to the opening of the jar, this was the only way to do it, as the dirt itself was moist and clumpy, because some of the dirt that I had grabbed was from the creek itself, while the creek dirt from the bank was a little bit moist after a fresh rain just the day before. I did my best to flatten the earth into place, and once I was satisfied with the level that was in the jar, it was time to add the plants. First up was a batch of clover and some grass. I proceeded to shove it towards the back of the terrarium, while peeling off the clump of dirt from the bottom and patting it down onto the bottom itself. Up next were two plants that I did not recognize. And after having failed to use a trowel properly and having lacerated a little bit of the local vegetation, it has become very clear to everybody watching that I have no idea what I'm doing when it comes to this. I simply watched a few videos on the internet, decided to give it a go myself. And after adding a few dead leaves that I found on the pavement while walking home, and a piece of tree bark, it was time to add the isopods. But before adding the isopods, I poured in some distilled water. This would keep the terrarium moist and would ensure a cycle of evaporation from the terrarium surface, condensation on the sides and on top of the terrarium, and then falling down as miniature rain, helping establish a nice, moist microclimate inside the terrarium that would keep the earthworm happy, keep the plants happy, and keep the isopods happy as they enjoy moist environments. I then proceeded to add the 3 isopods to the terrarium. They are also known as roly-polies or pill bugs. And then I gave this inside a quick wipe down. Sealed up the jar eventually, and my terrarium was complete. And here it is, soaking up the light from a reptile light inside the terrarium left over from my corn snake that died a few years ago. Checking back in a couple hours later, I noticed that the isopods had taken a liking to the clover at the back. This was a bit concerning, as my goal was to grow plants, not to have them be food for the isopods. Although hard to see, they were back there, munching away on the clover. This is not at all what I had anticipated. I figured the isopods would go after the dead oak leaves I'd put in for them, but they went after the clover instead. With this in mind, I left the house Monday morning to spend 5 days in the hospital for a standard epilepsy test, nothing major. I wasn't sure what I would find when I got back. But what I did come back to was not at all what I was expecting after what I had seen when I went to bed Sunday night. Okay, so here we go, Friday afternoon. 3, 2, 1. Reveal. The terrarium looks pretty much just as I had left it Monday morning. But upon closer inspection, I realized the isopods were nowhere in sight. I searched frantically around in the terrarium, looking for any signs of life. But apart from the plants, all was silent, and all was still. No movements. Nothing. This made no sense to me. Isopods naturally like moist environments, and there was condensation consistently on the sides of the jar. So why weren't they out? They couldn't have possibly died, could they? I wasn't sure. I checked all up and down, even picking up the jar, trying to scan at the gravel base, seeing for any signs of life, but there was nothing. After looking around some more, only to find nothing, I decided to place it back inside the terrarium, except this time cutting off all light to try and simulate a night cycle. Maybe they were hiding because the light had been on for the past 5 days straight. After placing it back in my glass container, I turned out the reptile light and left it out for a few hours. Coming back a few hours later, I found this. Life inside the terrarium was just as still as it was before. But there was a problem. All the sides of the jar were now completely fogged up. The only way we could see inside was through the lid. and still no sign of the isopods, so I had to take matters into my own hands. After searching around some more, I set my iPod down, and I opened up the jar, something I didn't think I'd have to do for a few months. It wasn't what I wanted to do, but it had to be done. I had to clear up some of the excess condensation so the light would have a chance at reaching the plants. I also moved the bark around as it was crushing a leaf, and decided to take that opportunity to see if there was any isopods hiding under there. Nothing. After a little bit more rearranging, I shut the jar. As can be seen here, I wiped off some of the excess condensation at the top. Aiming my iPod into the jar, I looked for any signs of the isopods. Any. Just one. Nothing. I knew that the only thing that had to be done, and what could be done, was to set the terrarium back inside and leave it in the darkness of the night. And what I came back to the next morning filled me with relief. Look! I know it's hard to see, but do you guys see it? An isopod on the clover leaf, and one underneath it. They were alive and well all this time. I was overwhelmed with joy. Thank you guys so much for watching. I will upload an update video within the next couple weeks.